So, all right, today I've brought somebody who's going to give a lot of value to somebody who is an author and maybe a lot to think about for somebody who wants to be an author. So, Alice Draper is the host of a podcast called My Rejection Story, which I love. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And that's how I found her. But behind all of the podcast, she really has a very substantial business, and her business is called Hustling Writers. And Hustling Writers has an amazing ability to get writers publicity. And this is the big word writers don't want to hear and don't want to know about most often, but is critical. So I'm going to ask Alice all about how writers or authors actually get their book in front of eyeballs. So Alice, firstly, hello. And My Rejection Story. Tell me just a little bit about how that particular podcast came about.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me today, Sarah. I'm really excited for the conversation. My Rejection Story is a podcast where I interview authors, only authors for now, and they talk about rejections, but also, the how they leverage rejections, how they dealt with them, how these rejections often foreshadow their success, and then also all the rejection stories of their book, so how they actually got their book in the hands of the reader, whether they're self-published or got the book deal. There's a story of one guy who grew his Instagram following to 140,000 followers to get his first book deal. But then there's other stories of people who self-published and make tons and tons of money with their self-published model. So yeah, it's kind of a diverse place for authors to hear their rejection stories, to hear other authors' rejection stories, both personal and professional. And I started it because I find the topic of rejection really interesting, and I don't think that it's been researched or discussed a lot in that what I've seen. It's something I started talking about a lot when I built my career as a journalist initially. Was chasing rejections changed things drastically for me. And then I noticed that the theme plays up in much bigger ways where those rejections we face in our personal life are, everyone has them. And I think that there's a huge space for us to start talking about them and talking about how we deal with them, so that they're not just setbacks, they can become part of our arsenal, our toolkit for how we navigate the world.
Absolutely. And I mean, there isn't an author out there who has had their book snapped up, really. And I mean, this is a hard thing to swallow in any creative pursuit, but generally, yes. I mean, rejection is such a part of being a published author, and as you said, in many fields. So, of course, that's one part of being an author is firstly just getting the deal, right? So it's either pitching or it's opting for self-publish, and rejection we would be part of that game. But you come in a little bit later in your hustling writers business, and that's really one of the big questions we're going to chat about today. So, firstly, you take authors from a published book and get them publicity. So firstly, who are the main authors you work with? And at what point do they find you? What have they done, tried?
Yeah, yeah. So all of the clients I've had so far are nonfiction authors. I haven't yet worked with a fiction author, and usually their book is supplemental to another business model as well. So they're often like keynote speakers or coaches or consultants. And they've written a book based on their years of experience, and they need to get this book in the hands of as many people as possible. So the primary driver of what we do together is I get them booked on podcasts. So they, identify who their target audience is. So maybe they wrote a leadership book. So their target audience are corporate professionals, leaders, C-suites, people working 9 to 5 jobs. And so I will identify, my team will identify which podcasts have those sorts of listeners, and we will pitch the podcasts. And, like I just had a client who left recently just because he's burnt out from all the podcasts he's been talking on, but he wrote a kind of career slanted book, and he got on 30 podcasts in a 3-month cycle, and his book was a #1 Amazon bestseller on the day of launch, and it sold out on Amazon in some countries on the day of launch. And that's all because he'd actually asked a lot of podcast hosts to release their conversation on the day of launch. So there was this huge drive. And if we know anything about bestseller lists, often bestseller lists are looking at like what happened in that first week of the launch. Where you selling a lot, it's not necessarily like over a 5-year period did you sell a lot of copies. So it could be really strategic like that. But yeah, so I guess your question was, when do they find me? They find me at different stages. Some people come to me after the book is launched, which is, it's a bit like planting a tree. Like it's, we're not going to get you that great best-selling book in the first week if you only find me after your book is launched. So the sooner you start, the better, like planting a tree. Some people find me a year before their book has been launched. It just depends. I've had some clients who've been working with me just to get more exposure in their business, and then they decided to do the book, and then we carried on the publicity and the PR leading up to the book launch, but they didn't come to me because of the book launch.
So really interesting, because the awareness that you're really shining a light on is that for many people, a book is part of a broader growth strategy. And those are the people, as you said. Question. So now you focus on getting them podcasts. And you are making a direct link between podcasts and book sales. Now, is that always the case? Because I've had so many authors. In fact, I bumped into one today who spoke to me about the book, Susan. I'll tell you her name in a second. Her book called Finding Finn, Making Finn. She said she was in every newspaper, every radio, every TV show. Book sold 900 copies. So now, is there a direct link that you notice between getting publicity in this way with podcasts and actual book sales?
I mean, so it's very hard to track the exact numbers unless the client had like a special link on the podcast thing. But even then, the podcast listeners are usually going to just type in the name in Amazon. They're not going to go click in the show notes, because I don't go click in show notes. If I'm here an interesting guest and I'm like, oh, this sounds like an interesting book, I'm probably just going to directly type it in and order it. So it's very hard to track that. But what my clients have done is they have a graph showing their sales. And so they've seen that this podcast episode released and then the sales did this. Or the publisher reports back and says, what did you do yesterday? Because there was a sudden spike in your sales. But like you said, media is not created equally. Like some podcasts are more niche, and so there will just be less people listening. So you may not get that spike. Or some may not be the perfect fit for the book. If you wrote a book about, I don't know, horses, and you're on a podcast about like career growth or something, that the audience just may not be interested in what you're saying. So it's all about the fits of the media you're into. That's quite important.
So matching it exactly, yeah. Now, do a lot of the authors come to you who are self-published? Because traditional publishers generally do give a little bit of publicity to an author. However, I have noticed, and I know from my personal experience, that they are much more focused on above the line. So there are your TV, radio, they don't get a lot of podcast interviews, I have noticed, and with all of my authors. So I'm assuming yours are traditionally, self-published.
I
And
get a mix. So I have, oh, sorry. You
no,
sorry,
continue.
answer.
Yeah. So the kinds of authors, apart from just nonfiction.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, one of my clients is published with Barrett Cooler, which is an imprint of Penguin, and then a lot of my clients go the hybrid route, which is where they actually pay upfront for a publisher, and then they kind of make the money back because their royalties are much higher than they would be with traditional. And all of those come with some PR, I think, but I honestly think that my clients who've gone the hybrid route have received more in-house PR than my clients who've gone the traditional route. And I think, in my conversation with you, Sarah, I think maybe you highlighted this on the podcast, which is that more niche book deals, they often don't invest a lot of, maybe it wasn't you, maybe it was someone else. They often don't invest as much money into marketing you if you are a more niche author, the traditional publishers. So if they've given you a whopping book deal, have given you like $250,000, they're going to put a lot of money in making sure your book gets a lot of publicity because they need to make that $250,000 plus back. But if you got a very small book deal, they are not going to invest a lot of their funds into making your book. And as you see it with the covers, like some of the traditional publishers didn't even invest in like a proper cover artist. And it's like, no one's going to pick that book up because that cover is so boring. It doesn't stand out. So yeah, I actually think that my clients have gone the hybrid route. Have received more support in-house. But like you said, it's very rarely podcast. And because writing a book is supplemental to their business, they want that book to be in as many hands as possible, which is why they reach out to someone like me.
So absolutely. And this is the big divide between people who kind of want to write a book because it's a calling or it's something they feel they want to share with the world, and people who really see it as a business card, a leverage, an opportunity. So let's just assume that somebody's not hiring somebody like you. What can a published author in the nonfiction realm do to get eyeballs on their brand or their book? So what would you recommend some basic steps they can take themselves, maybe?
Yeah. And I just want to say, like, if they're not, because my clients who come work with me have a lot of money because they have this whole other business model, so they can afford someone like me. But the thing about that like professional niche is that it's very saturated, and a lot of the books are kind of similar. So for nonfiction authors listening who are not doing this as a supplement to their business model, and they're doing it because they're really interested in what they're doing, chances are you are writing about something a lot more different than what most other people are, which means you can stand out in the media because you're not saying the same thing that a lot of other people have done. So my advice coming from a podcast publicist is to pitch yourself to podcasts. You have a book, you have a story, you have probably written something different to what other people have done. So there's no reason why you shouldn't be pitching the media. And I think that, to stand out, like I was talking to a publicist who does a sort of TV side, and she was saying that one of her best clients wrote a book about mold, and that he just got the best media. And I was like, well, of course, because it's so different to what everyone else is writing. Like, there's so much you can do with that, like how to get rid of mold in your house at this time of year, how to do this with mold. Like, so if you do have a very niche and specific book, or a book that hasn't been explored before, my advice would be to pitch yourself to podcasts. Don't wait around for someone to kind of pick up on your media stuff. Create your own media tailwind.
Absolutely. I love that you're saying that because honestly, writers don't always think like that. Very few of my authors have pitched themselves to podcasts. So, and is it a simple question of, I'm sure one can get referrals or one can Google or the ones you listen to and they just mail them. Would you mail them a pitch document and say, this is my website, this is my book. Do you want to interview me? I'm assuming it's as simple as that in a way.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's
So,
complicated.
I mean, I have a pitch like strategy, a way of pitching that kind of I think stands out to the normal way, because how most people pitch podcasts is they just say, "This is who I am, and this is what I wrote." And because podcast hosts get pitched that all the time, it's quite boring, and they often don't read it. So, what my recommendation is one, yeah, if you have any friends that have been on podcasts, you can just look up what podcast they've been on, and you can pitch them and just say like, we have a mutual friend, so and so. I enjoyed your episode about XYZ that you did with her. But yeah, my strategy, and I have a template so you don't have to memorize this. It's on my website, hustlingwriters/template. But my strategy would be to open with a very specific reference to the podcast, just to show them that you listened. So you would say something like, "Hi, Sam, I loved your episode about rainforests," or whatever. It made me realize that I should think about like the contribution to the Amazon rainforest when I make purchases or whatever. Something that's not like broad, like I love your podcast, because that's not believable. It's more like you're just highlighting a very specific thing that they said signals this is a real listener, someone that knows what I'm talking about. And then I would open up with a narrative. So it could be as simple as putting like the first paragraph of your book blurb there, but something that's shocking, a scene. I once had a client who she talked and wrote about workplace bullying. So we would open with the podcast scene of like her boss screaming, like it was something like you're useless. My boss screamed at me as she slammed the file on the desk. So an emotive scene that kind of draws them into a story. And then your speaking points. So then it would be like in this episode, or you could contextualize it. You'd be like, I dealt with workplace bullying for 5 years, and now I'm on a mission to shed light on it or change the narrative or whatever. And then you would have some speaking points, because this is all like you're trying to get into the mind of a podcast host. So they're like, what's the story? Why is this interesting? Okay, now if they're still invested because the story is interesting, what are you going to talk about? What value are my listeners going to get? So then that's when you would give some speaking points. So you'd say in this episode, we can talk about, and then list like maybe 4 or 5 bullet points, how to handle a workplace bullier, how to draw boundaries, whatever they are. And then if they've read through that and they're like, still invested, still valuable, this is still something great that my listeners will take a lot away from, then they want to know, who are you and can you pull this off? So then I would like put a bio, which it doesn't have to be long, 2 to 3 lines, some of the most interesting things about you, most credible things about you, and then links, because now if they read all that, they're still interested, then they want to go do some research. So make that as easy as possible for them and just share your website, social media, your book, whatever it is.
Genius. Genius. That sounds so simple, but it's a new world for authors, of which there are so many. Alice, is there anything to look out for? I mean, for example, and I've personally been interviewed in a podcast, and when I went back and looked, I actually realized that all of the podcasts this person had done had like 5 listeners. So is there some vetting you should do in general? Can things go
Yeah.
wrong? Mm.
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing about podcasts is that anyone can create a podcast. So, if you are going on a podcast, you have no guarantee that anyone is listening. And that's not to say, very few podcasts would carry on indefinitely if no one was listening. But the number of people can vary wildly. So, the unfortunate thing about podcasts is that you can't publicly see downloads. Only the host has access to that back end. So, only the host will know how many people are actually downloading. But there are other things you can look at. One is Apple Podcasts. So that gives you a number of ratings. And obviously, the more ratings, you can assume the more people are listening. So a lot of the smaller podcasts, you would think at least if it's at least like 30 to 40, this should be a decent listenership. And then another thing is Listen Notes. So that's listennotes.com. And they give like a ranking of podcasts. So they'll say top 5%, top 1%, top 0.5%. So if you open it and there's no ranking at all, you can assume that there's not much of a listenership. If you open it and see that it's top 1%, you're looking at listeners probably in the thousands. If it's top 0.5%, you're looking at listeners probably in the 10,000s. So that can, I sort of use in-house, we use those together. We can look at people's social media, but social media is not always reflective of listenership. There are some big podcasts with small social media followings, and then some huge social media followings and small podcasts.
So, okay, so fantastic. And then final question, really, as we move to the end, what about other mediums? I mean, podcasts are one. Do you recommend or look at what is your opinion really on your LinkedIn's and your Instagram and your Facebook promoting of your book? Do you find it a better strategy to go straight with podcasts, mix and match? How does that work?
I look at them as kind of complementary to each other. So like, for example, my clients all have active social media channels, and that to me is quite important because I think that having that an active branding supports the PR you're trying to get, because if people find what you're doing interesting and all your social media channels are dead, it's just harder. It's harder. They're not going to stay as engaged with your content. But in terms of like purely how you're going to get the word out there for your book, I'm very big on partnerships because building a LinkedIn following or Instagram following is really hard if you're just doing it alone. And one of the biggest, best ways I think of getting some momentum is to partner with people who already have audiences. And that does not just need to be podcasting. It can be, pitching a coach to come do a workshop with her, with their team. It can be pitching to talk at events. Getting in front of a live audience is even better than an online audience. Um, Anything where you can partner with other people and other organizations that have an audience is, I think, a very effective thing that you should be focusing on as an author.
Fantastic advice, really. That is just absolutely brilliant because, there's a limit to which you can be self-promoting on Facebook, Instagram, and those. I mean, I love it. I love all of your tips, particularly for authors who don't have that following, that these joint ventures, these partnerships are what take you there. And it's also, I just want to highlight again something you said, which is so true, that no matter where somebody hears you, their next step is always going to be Googling you. So either they're going to go to Amazon and type in your name and try and find your book, or they're going to just find out who you are in general, and then hopefully they end up on your website, which is why it's so important you make yourself visible as an author.
Yes. Yes. So
Google
having
is our
that
friend.
website, having stuff where people land on it, they're getting a really good impression of you is really helpful. If you can create a website for your book with beautiful branding, beautiful text, that means that when they look at it, it's like, oh, this looks like a really well finished, well put together product that I would be proud to showcase on my podcast, or whatever else you're pitching for. So having the branding together, I think, is a very important supplementary asset to have when you're pitching yourself.
Exciting. Okay, Alice, you've given authors some really great, fantastic tips. And again, I stress that it's not in their frame of reference. Very few of my authors get themselves on podcasts. And I don't know if it's an American model, but we certainly across the globe have got to jump on this huge trend. Podcasts are huge. They do have ears listening, and that is the point of writing a book. It's to get your message to more people, whatever the message may be. And I also just loved what you said about the book about damp being so popular. We put our hearts, I always laugh about this with my authors. We write about our hearts and our souls and this deep and this meaningful and this fantastic book of years of our lived experience. And it is the book about cats, that funny cat jokes that, or mold or damp that gets it's so I don't know what the message is, and maybe it's also to people to not overthink, overwork, and people like humor and they like practical as
Mm,
well.
mm. And getting very specific. I mean, that's been, what I always try to focus on in pitching is like we don't want a big, broad pitch that deals with like a huge subject area. If we can zero in on something really specific, I want to know about that one instance and the takeaways you took from it one instance and not what you learned over 10 years, because broad topics have been spoken about a million times.
Exactly. Okay, well, fantastic. Alice, you've given us a lot of fantastic food for thought, and I hope everyone takes this forward and really uses it to get their book not just published. That's one thing, but we don't want our books sitting on the desks. We want them out there, people hearing our message, and this is all part of the game. So thank you for joining me, and all of the links you mentioned will be below in the YouTube. Um, and thank you so much for all of your advice and tips.
Thank you so much for having me, Sarah. This was fantastic.
Great.